Morning, everyone. We are now up to Perek Beis, Mishna Aleph, Chapter 2, Mishnah 1. There is a halacha when it comes to separating truma, that when you are separating truma, let's say, as we mentioned many times before, you have one pile of grain and you want to separate from truma from one pile for another pile. The halacha is, and according to most opinions, this is the Raisis, the Torah law, that they have to be near each other. It can't be that they're far away. The pile that you're separating from and the pile you're separating for need to be near each other. Okay? Just 1 second. Right, they should be in proximity of each other. What exactly is that amount of proximity? At some point we'll come and see, but they have to be close to each other. That is a halacha. And therefore, based on that halacha, our Mishnah teaches, Ein tarmin mitar ala tamei. We may not take truma from something that is tar for something that is tamei. So let's say you have a pile of grain. It's attached from the ground. One pile became tamei, ritually impure. The other one isn't. The pile that's ritually impure, you're allowed to eat. You don't take truma from that because truma that is tamei, that is impure, a kohen cannot eat. So you want to separate from a pile of grain that is tar. You want to take the truma from that for the pile of grain that's tamei. So we say that the Mishnah says you can't do that. We do not separate from the tar for the tamei. From the pile of tar produce for the pile of tamei produce. And the reason is because we mentioned before. The halacha is that when you separate truma from one pile for another, they should be close to each other. And if one is tar and one is tamei, we're afraid you're not going to want them to be close to each other. You're afraid of having them close to each other, lest the pure grain become impure. And therefore, we're afraid that you won't fulfill this halacha of min hamukaf, it's called, being in proximity of each other. Therefore, the Chachamim instituted that you do not separate from tahar for tamei. The imtarmu, but if they did separate trumas and truma, then the truma is a good truma. Because even if you actually would not fulfill the halacha proximity itself, and minamukaf itself, it wouldn't invalidate the truma. All the more so when we're talking about this kind of situation where it's only a rabbinical decree not to separate. And again, if this is the halacha not to separate from the tar for the tamei, and at the end of the day, you would have to separate from the tamei, the truma, to at least permit it to yourself, even though the kohen isn't going to be able to eat it. Next halacha, the emes amru. In truth, the sages said, ha'igol shel devela, shenitma miktsasai. You have a round cake of pressed figs. That was what they used to use. Take the figs and press them all together and glue them all together with some kind of a juice. And it became like this whole big block. They call it a cake of figs. Now, shenitma miktsasai, part of it became tamei. Let's just get the case. You have this cake of figs, a bunch of figs pressed together, and we're saying part of it is tamei, part of it is not tamei. In this situation, Torah minha tahar sheyesh bay al hatamei sheyesh bay. You can take truma from the tar part of it for the tamei part of it. You could do that. They're very close to each other. They're really close to each other. Nonetheless, in this kind of situation, we say you can separate from the tar part for the tamei part. The same thing if you have a bundle of vegetables that are tied together. The same thing if you have a pile of grain. There, the halacha is the same thing. Part of it is tar, part of it is tamei. You can separate from the tar part for the tamei part. Now, the first thing we have to explain is, how is it possible, if we're saying, how is it possible, for instance, you've got all these figs pressed together, seeming that they're one unit, right? If they're one unit, so how can you have part of it tar and part of it tamei? If it's one unit, you don't have to touch the source of doesn't have to touch every part of it, touches one part of it, the whole thing becomes tamei. And the answer is that halachically, from the point of tuma, from the point of transmission of tuma, this cake of figs is not one unit. It's not one unit from the point of tuma. So it's not like when I touch one fig, it's like I'm touching the rest of the figs. What the situation I would have is when I touch one fig, like the source of tumah touches one fig, that fig will now make the next fig tameh, which perhaps can make the next fig tameh. But it becomes a transmission of tumah from one object to another object. And therefore, at some point of time, it's going to run out, so to speak, because the rule is that we have different levels of tumah. You've got the source of tumah itself. You've got what the tumah touches. So the source of tumah is called an av ha-tumah, the father tumah, the primary tumah. The next, what it touches is called a rishon, a first level. And what the rishon touches becomes a sheni, becomes a second level. And depending on what kind, the status of the objects, that's how far the transmission of tumah could actually continue. So for instance, if you're talking about chulin, you're talking about non-sacred objects, regular grain, regular figs. So let's say the source of tumah touches let's say it's a sheretz, it's a dead rodent. So it goes and it touches a fig. That fig becomes a rishon. The next fig would become theoretically a sheni, but the halacha is, right, it becomes a sheni. But when you're dealing with chulin, a sheni doesn't make a shlishi, doesn't make a third. And therefore, at some point, the transmission stops. So that's how you could have a cake, a cake of figs, a part of it is going to be tahar, part of it is going to be tameh. The same thing with the bundle of vegetables and the pile of grain. These things, for the laws of tumah, are not considered one unit. There are many units touching each other, and therefore, at some point, the transmission doesn't continue, so you have part of it being tar, part of it being tameh. The point of the Mishnah is that although we just said you cannot separate from tar and tameh, here you could. And the answer is very simple, because there's no concern about the law of min hamukaf, of being close to each other, the law of proximity. They're right next to each other. They're literally touching each other. So in this kind of case, there's no problem separating from the tar for the tameh because of the fact that there's no problem of proximity. And apparently here also, the Chachamim didn't feel that it was necessary to make a across-the-board law of not separating from tar to tameh, and therefore this kind of situation becomes the exception. And the same thing applies to a guda shel yerek, which means a bundle of vegetables. And then we talk about a pile of grain. So the Bartanura speaks out that the reason why the Mishnah is going through all these cases is because it's going up in the novelty. You know, the cake of figs, you can hear that's considered, the proximity is there because they're glued together, they're connected together. Maybe plants that are only tied together would be different. The Mishnah said no, even when they're tied together, it's considered that the law of proximity is good enough here, and we don't make any, and we say it's okay. A pile of grains not even tied together, just bundled, just piled on top of each other. That's even considered a less kind of a connection. And maybe regarding this whole rabbinic decree about being concerned with proximity should apply here by the pile of grain. And therefore the Mishnah says no, even by the pile of grain, it does not apply. Then the Mishnah says how you shnei yigulim, but if we're talking about 2 cakes of figs, shtei agudis, talking about 2 bundles of vegetables, shtei aremois, or 2 piles of grain, achas tmea v'achas tahira, one's tummy, one's tahar, lo yitra mizeh al zeh, you not take off truma from one to the other. This second part of the Mishnah seems to be obvious, and the commentaries talk about what exactly is the point of this addition to the Mishnah. It's very obvious from the first part, because we talked about 1 pile and 1 bundle, and this second part is of 2. It would be obvious. We're not going to go into that right now, what they say to answer that. Now, a couple of interesting halachas, and that is the following. The Yad Avram brings this down. Our Mishnah's leniency applies only as long as the tar produce and tameh produce remain parts of a single entity. However, if the tar and tameh produce are separated from each other, one may no longer designate the tar produce as truma for the tameh produce. They've got to be together. Just because at one point in time they were together is not going to help you. If they were together but then became separated, then it's like 2 piles. Furthermore, the Mishnah's leniency applies only if the tameh portion became tameh after the single entity was formed. However, if one forms a single entity out of a tar produce and produce that was already tameh, he may not designate the tar portion as truma for the tameh portion. Since this was forbidden when the tar produce and tamei produce were separate entities, combining them into a single entity does not remove the restriction. So here too, if we're talking about that you had two separate piles, one was tar, one was tamei, and then they came together, we're not going to say, oh, well, they're together now, I can separate from the other. If at one point of time there was an obligation to separate truma from each one was tar, one was tamei, at that point of time, the rabbinic decree applied not to separate from the tar for the tamei, then putting it together is not going to help you afterwards. It's talking about there was a pile of grain, it was tahar, and then at some point, part of it became tamei. That's where we say, so again, so this whole situation of tahar and tamei only happened when they were already together. At that point, we say, okay, they're in proximity to each other. You can separate from the tahar part from the tamei part. And the Mishnah concludes, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, tar min hatar ala tamei. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you could separate from the tar for the tamei. Rabbi Eliezer did not hold that there is a need to have to make a special decree of not separating from tar from tamei out of a fear that they won't be close enough to each other. He's not concerned with that, and therefore he said you may separate truma from you may separate from the tahar part from tahar produce for tamei produce, but the halacha is not like Rebbe Eliezer. It's not permitted to designate tahar produce as truma for a different tamei item. That's the Mishnah. Now let's do the Sefer HaMitzvot. Prohibition against hating in one's heart a adam kasher from Yisrael. Yisrael is considered a kasher, meaning the person is not a sinner. We'll see a little bit more what that means. Shenemar, as it says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. So the Chavetz Chaim expands upon that. When one person sins against another, you do not bear a grudge and hate the person in your heart and remain silent. But rather, it's a mitzvah to let him know. To say him, why did you do this to me? And then you should wipe away the hatred from your heart. So again, the general rule, sometimes you have to know when this actually is applicable to do. But as a rule, the starting point is somebody does something wrong to you, you don't keep it inside, you let them know. Perhaps if letting them know is only going to aggravate things, then the mitzvah doesn't apply. But assuming that you can just let them know, and then afterwards, there won't be any problems. You have a mitzvah that if somebody did something wrong to you, don't leave it inside. You let him know about it. Don't just leave it inside and let it and say, well, I'll just forget about it. If a person could just forget about it, what's then? It could be that you don't have to say anything to him. Never thought about that. If you could actually honestly say that, you forgot about it, there's no hatred in your heart about it. But clearly telling somebody that when they did something wrong to you, you tell them about it, that clearly, it's a release from inside of you, and that allows you to actually then, forget about it. If a person could actually forget about it beforehand, would we say you don't have to say it? Quite possible. But in a number of circumstances, if a person is hurt by someone else and is hurt by them, the Torah prohibits us from just keeping it in. The Torah tells us we have to let the person know. And then once we do that, one has to then erase the hatred from one's heart, of course, as best as possible. Now, let's say you're talking about a person that you saw him commit a sin. The hisrabai, you warned him beforehand, it didn't hold back. So basically, and again, so we're talking about here, the kind of sin that, again, a person should know is wrong. You warn him just to make sure that he knows. And now, it's the kind of sin, let's put it this way. It's the kind of sin that you want to warn him about, that you feel you need to warn him about, because maybe he doesn't know about it. I mean, there are certain sins that that even if the person's not warned about, he knows obviously it's wrong. But we're talking about a sin where, maybe he doesn't exactly understand what's wrong or the severity, and you warn him. He does it anyway. That means he intentionally sinned. And that person is not anymore under the category of achicha, your brother, at least from this point of the mitzvah. Of course, he's a fellow Jew. But from the point of what the Torah says, don't have dislike for a person in your heart against a fellow Jew. It has to be a fellow Jew that's called Achicha, your brother. And a fellow Jew that intentionally sinned, you warned him and he did it anyway. That means he seriously intentionally sinned. Then that person, for this purpose, is not called your brother in this context. And therefore, that's the kind of person that we actually say there is no prohibition against disliking because of what he did. If you see that he committed a sin, you warned him and he didn't go back on it. He didn't take it back. Didn't stop. Raise a mitzvah listener, you say. Actually, the way the HaMitzvot says it, it's a mitzvah to dislike him for it, because of the fact that he willingly, intentionally, even after being warned, sinned. This applies in all places, at all times, both by men and by women. Of course, if this particular wife, if you want to try to help this person do tshuva, that's not a question. You should help him do that. You should feel bad for him. But there is a certain level of dislike that one may have, and the Chavetz Chaim's words is even a mitzvah to have, if you know the person intentionally sinned. Again, that does not take away from having rachmanas, having mercy, feeling mercy for the person, and actually trying to help him do tshuva. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos.